Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, Dr. Joel Myers and I share the untold story behind the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 and reveal how weather may have played a major role. Plus, would Chicago be the big city it is today without the 1871 fire? It's one of the questions we answer in our segment, What If? And we're revealing the three most historic droughts in U.S. history. One actually impacted 36% of the country. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. More than 150 years ago, a massive and deadly fire burned out of control through Chicago, changing the city forever. Now, could the weather in October of 1871 have been a factor? It's one of the fascinating stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, when climate and weather shaped history. Joining me now to help us delve deeper into the untold story of the Great Chicago Fire is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. And the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, it's this story and others where, you know, you knew the story, but there's a lot more to it, especially pertaining to climate and weather. Let's talk about the climate. How did that shape the Great Chicago Fire?
Well, you're right about the beginning. Sometimes people's impression of what happened is not correct.
Right.
I learned in school that O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern and burned down the city.
Which is something I've heard about the Chicago Fire, but I never heard that story.
Oh yeah, well, it was in the history books when I was a child, but there's much more to the story.
Sure.
But obviously the weather played a role, whatever the cause. And we'll get to the cause in a couple of minutes. But it was very dry. It was one of the worst droughts in history. There had been only half the normal amount of rainfall in the months leading up to the fire on October 8th in Chicago and throughout the Midwest. And it was particularly dry prior to the fire. No rain for a week or more prior to the fire. And on the day of the fire, it was particularly dry. Not only had everything dried out, but the humidity was down 30% or less. And there was a wind, so everything was set up for fires to spread.
Yeah, that wind and the dryness that day really helped it spread quickly.
But it also helped dry it out. But you have
Right.
low humidity and wind, evaporation, so any remaining moisture around was evaporated, so everything was dry. It was all kindling. And you got to remember, cities in those days were a lot different than they are today. It was mainly wood. It was mainly wood, and they didn't have the fire regulations. They built whatever they had. The whole lack of any kind of code, and so and cities were, as I said, there was hay and there was farms mixed in with the city, and
it's not the concrete that we see today.
Correct.
Every story has a legend, and this, you mentioned it before, Mrs. O'Leary's cow. What is the legend behind that?
Well, first of all, there was discrimination against Irish immigrants, and so stories spread, and it was that apparently Mrs. O'Leary wanted to burn down the city. People actually thought that, but the story was, and it was in the history books, that she was milking her cow, and the cow kicked over a lantern, it caught the hay on fire, and the fire spread and burned down the whole city. That was not the case.
Wasn't the only fire, though. You know, oftentimes when you get at that dry, it's just not one single point, but there were fires within a few days across the area, correct?
Well, there were. We didn't have mass communications in those days. There was no way to know what was going on in real time except for the telegraph. And so what happened was, apparently there were major fires in other cities within a couple hundred miles of Chicago, in Peoria, in several cities in Wisconsin and in Michigan, and some of them much more catastrophic in terms of loss of life. There was one small town where 1,200 people died, and only one building was left standing out of thousands. And so apparently it was a meteorite that was observed entering the atmosphere with sound and fury, and enough reached the ground and set. Remember, it was dry throughout the Midwest, kindling, and cities being different than they are today. And so debris from the meteorite touched off, I believe, the fires in many places around the Midwest.
They were describing fire tornadoes and very scary scenes just because of that fire and smoke rising and those gusty winds coming out of the west-southwest.
Well, when you have, as you know, a hot air rising, you could often get a swirl, like the water goes down the tub, and that can turn into a tornado or a mini tornado, or swirl. And fires do that too. Volcanoes do that. So whenever you have a lot of hot air rising,
Like a city like Chicago or New York City, seems unlikely that that would occur again.
on that scale.
Scale, yes.
Yeah, where 1/3 of people were made homeless, and 1/3 of the buildings. Yeah, because today concrete and steel and the construction is much more sturdy, and their building codes. Of course, from a meteorite coming in hot enough, one bigger and stronger, could set fire. We go back to what wiped out the dinosaurs. There was tremendous fires on the earth.
And you mentioned the city of Chicago, ironically, may not be the city of Chicago without that fire.
That's correct. And look at the disaster occurred in some of these other cities. I mean, it was horrible. Some people escaped. The one in Wisconsin, I think, people tried to rush to the river to escape this inferno. And many of them died, drowned in the river, and the things collapsed. I mean, it was horrendous in some of these other cities. So it wasn't just Chicago, but you never heard about that until I did the research and really looked into it. And looked into these stories of a meteorite and fires in all these other towns.
Thanks, Joe. We'll speak with you in a few minutes when we go over some what-if scenarios for the Great Chicago Fire. For more detail on the Great Chicago Fire from a local perspective, let's bring in Peter Alter. He is Chief Historian of the Chicago History Museum. Peter, thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks very much for having me.
How catastrophic was the fire, and how large was the damaged area?
The damaged area was a large area, although it was not the entire city. It stretched from roughly 1600 north, so a couple of miles north of downtown Chicago, and then roughly 12th Street or so on the south, which is Roosevelt Road, and then about 2 miles or so west of downtown. And then, of course, Lake Michigan on the east.
As bad as the Chicago fire was, it sounds like it wasn't the worst of these fires in the area.
That's correct, yes. And our neighbors far to the north in Wisconsin, this Peshtigo fire, and the entire town of Peshtigo was wiped out.
The fire has become a legend on its own. As such, how has it impacted culture?
It's impacted culture, a great deal. You can, that classic Chicago phrase, hot time in the Old Town tonight. The Old Town is Chicago. Our Major League Soccer team here is called the Chicago Fire. The University of Illinois at Chicago sports teams, they play some athletics in Division I NCAA. They are called the Flames. Their campus is very close to where Mrs. O'Leary's barn was in 1871.
Let's talk about the damage caused by the fire, pertaining to the number of buildings and residents destroyed.
Sure, there were about 17,000 buildings destroyed within that fire limit that we've discussed. About 300 lives lost, and many millions of dollars in property damage. So that includes, for anyone who has visited, say, downtown Chicago, that would include the entire Loop area. And those viewers who might have visited, for example, Millennium Park, which is sort of our great downtown park with the famous bean, that was eventually the dump for a lot of the fire debris. So stuff has been uncovered. Even within the last 20 years, stuff was uncovered in that part of downtown.
And it is my understanding that the fire also transformed the city of Chicago.
It did very much so. So with the fire limit building codes and the emphasis on heavy masonry, there was an era in the 1870s and early 1880s where we saw low-rise, heavy buildings. But by the late 1800s, early 1900s, business and political leaders looked around at those immediate post-fire buildings and thought, maybe those aren't the most beautiful structures. Let's take some of those out and replace them. And so a lot of those late 1800s, early 1900s buildings for which Chicago is famous, and those famous architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, Adler, and so on, they really reformed the city in maybe the 20 to 30 years after the fire.
Peter Alter, Chief Historian of the Chicago History Museum, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Coming up later, we reveal the 3 most historic droughts to impact the United States. But next, we look at how Chicago might have fared if the fire never happened. Stay with us. We'll tell you after the break. Welcome back. It's time for our segment, What If? We'll take a look at how Chicago might have been a very different city if the Great Fire of 1871 had not occurred. All right, joining me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. It is fascinating. We're going to get into this, how a fire may have actually helped out a city in the long term. We'll get to that in a second. But first, let's talk about what if. Let's start with the rainfall. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about drought breeds fires when you have all of the right conditions. And the fact that it was so dry was certainly one of the big contributors. But what if? How much rain do you think that they were running about 4 inches or 5 inches below where they should be during that period of summer into October?
Compared to normal for the several months leading up to the fire, it was about half of normal, which is a big deviation. One of the driest period, you look back over 150 years or more, I think it was among the top 3 or 4 driest such periods. And that was good. When you look at weather and climate in general, the tremendous impact it has on humanity, and that's what this book's all about. When you have a drought, you have it has an impact on crop growth, the risk of fires we see in the West, in California and so on, how from one year to another, depending on how much rain, how the risk of wildfires, they can be 3, 4, 5 times as great. So clearly, the weather and climate has a big impact on humans and all the things they do and what they need to survive. And in this case, obviously, the risk of a fire, everything was set, and then the meteorite came and touched it off. If it had been normal rainfall, the fires would have been a lot less. They would have been able to be put out easily, or more easily than they were, even though the firefighting equipment was nothing then like it is today. But just think about it. This fire destroyed 1/3 of all the houses, all the buildings in Chicago, a big city. And in some of the other cities, it destroyed virtually all the buildings that existed.
It was also the wind. You had to have one or the other, right?
Yeah.
Because, the being dry may have, you had the kindling, but boy, the wind, even today, the wind is what really allows things to go out of control.
Once you have a fire, the wind also helps dry it out when you blow humidity, so it sets the stage. And then, of course, when the wind's blowing, it helps spread the fire like crazy, and that's what happened, not only in Chicago, but across the Midwest. It was windy. It took 2 days for the wind to die down and finally for some light rain. 48 hours, really, for the fire to burn itself out completely.
Paradoxically, Chicago was able to grow and become a bigger city because of the fire? Am I wording that correctly?
I think so. Who's to tell what would have happened? But clearly, Chicago grew into one of America's great cities. Even today, and for most of the history of the United States, it was the number 2 city after New York before California and LA developed. So, certainly the fire set the stage for rebuilding. And rebuilt with a better code and so on. And so it's probably the case that without that fire, the city of Chicago would not have flourished afterwards to the point that it has.
It also changed the building codes, right? That was part of the other thing. The way in which those buildings were constructed was another key contributor that if perhaps they were not constructed in such a way, maybe the fire wouldn't have spread as fast.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, because of the cost, the buildings were built in such a way with small pieces of wood and without any space between the floors. And so it was almost like a chimney. And once a fire started in those buildings, it just accelerated right up, and it was out of control literally in seconds. And it was the exact opposite of what a good building code or fire prevention would be.
I want to go back to the O'Leary's cow. It keeps coming back to that. What would have happened if the Chicago Evening Journal had not reported that the fire was actually started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow? Would that have changed anything?
Just think about that. For 150 years, most people who knew anything about the fire believed that that cow, Mrs. O'Leary's cow, an Irish person, where there was discrimination against the Irish in those days, kicked over the lantern and set the whole city ablaze.
Okay.
And just think about our news today and what we believe in different places. I went on for well over 100 years, but it was not the case.
It wasn't Mrs. O'Leary's cow. It was the meteor. Would that have changed anything do you believe?
Well, it certainly would have changed how it was described.
Right.
It's hard to say how people would have reacted. Clearly, meteors are a threat. They're rare. Very few people have been directly killed by meteors, but of course, a big meteor set it up for humans to populate the Earth and wipe out the dinosaurs. So that's not weather, but it's something from astronomy and outer space that can change the whole climate of the Earth, and all kinds of things follow from that. So we have to be aware, and we are much more today of meteors, meteorites, and the risk they pose, and a lot of research, NASA and so on, to prevent a catastrophe.
But it's really not any different than today. We hear about Coke cans that started a spark and created a whole fire. So if you think about it, a cow kicking over a candle isn't all that far-fetched, is it?
No, it was a very believable story.
It's a story at the time.
Yeah.
So, meteor or cow, whatever started this, and we do think it was a meteor, certainly it is an event that really shaped the city of Chicago.
But today, we would have known that with mass communications and mass media and so on, and knowing the fires were occurring at other places in the Midwest. But then that wasn't the case.
Wasn't the case. All right. Up next, find out which drought tops the list as the costliest in U.S. history. Number one may surprise you. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. Droughts are among the costliest natural disasters and tend to be long-lasting and slowly developing, with many adverse impacts over a rather large region. Droughts cause significant economic loss, with harmful impacts to many businesses, especially in the agricultural sector. The Midwest drought of 1871, a key contributor to the Great Chicago Fire, was one of many droughts that have been documented in North America. Here are some famous droughts in U.S. history. In the 16th century, a decades-long drought spread across North and Central America that may have contributed to the deaths of the first colonists at Jamestown, Virginia. The Dust Bowl from 1930 to 1936 was arguably one of the worst environmental disasters the U.S. faced in the 20th century. The drought covered more than 75% of the country and was a contributor to the Great Depression, one of the greatest economic depressions of all time. It is the costliest drought in U.S. history, with an economic loss adjusted to today's dollars likely in the hundreds of billions. Now, the drought of 1988 affected 36% of the country, resulting in an estimated cost of $53.6 billion adjusted to today's dollars, according to the National Centers for Environmental Information. Our warming planet is expected to result in droughts becoming more frequent, long-lasting, and intense. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joe Myers, for joining us today. And a big thanks to all of you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, send us an email at questions@AccuWeather.com. We look forward to seeing you next time.